Hello. So first of all, is there any question on yesterday's lecture? Something that you didn't understand? No? Everything was clear. Great. Okay, so let us continue. So what we have seen yesterday is that basically there are weak interaction, that describe beta decay, muon decays, etc. Pion decay also. I hope that you have done the exercise. Right? And we have seen that these weak interactions are described by gauge theory invariant under SU2 cross U1 symmetry. Right? And we have already guessed that actually this symmetry has to be broken in the vacuum, so it's a spontaneous breaking, down to U1 electromagnetism, at least to account the mass spectrum of the various particles. Right? So first of all, I want to tell you about the masses of the fermions. So how do we generate the masses for the fermions? Right? So I've already insisted yesterday that this SU2 cross U1 theory is a chiral theory. Right? Chiral theory meaning that the left-handed and the right-handed chirality of the fermion don't transform in the same way under the symmetry. And that's really a fundamental property of the standard model, right? And this is different than, for instance, what happens in QED or QCD, which are vector-like theory. So when you're dealing with electromagnetism, you're never really talking about left-handed or right-handed electron. I mean, you are always introducing one electron, one Dirac spinors, simply because QED is a vector-like theory, right? So the issue is that in chiral theory, you cannot write a mass term by hand for the particle simply because the mass term is not invariant under chiral symmetry, right? So if you write, for instance, the mass for the electron, right? If you remember a little bit of Dirac algebra, you remember that the Lagrangian of the mass term for the fermion always makes the two chiralities. That's the only thing which is invariant under Lorentz transformation, right? Plus, of course, Hermitian conjugate. But now the problem is that if the theory is chiral, those two objects transform differently. Right? They don't have opposite charges, so this is not invariant under the gauge symmetry anymore. Right? So this is okay in QED, but not in SU2 cross U1. Right? This is not possible in SU2 cross U1. I mean, this is a singlet, this is a doublet, so this clearly is not a singlet under the SU2 symmetry. So the way you want to introduce the masses is actually via the interaction with the Higgs boson, right? Right? So now you can form actually an operator which is invariant under SU2 cross U1 symmetry because simply you have two doublets. Out of two doublets you can construct a singlet. It is just group theory. So this is a singlet under SU2. So you add a singlet. This is still a singlet under SU2. And you can check the hypercharge. And this still should be invariant under U1 symmetry, right? Okay. Sometimes it's H or H dagger just to make it invariant under the U1 symmetry, but it doesn't matter. So now what will happen is that after electroweak symmetry breaking, you replace the X by vacuum expectation value, and this indeed become, in this case, simply the mass term. So it will be V square root of 2, and then we'll add something later on, times A. Right? So this is a Yukawa interaction. So here it's a Yukawa coupling. So the Lagrangian contains this interaction among the various fields, and after electroweak symmetry breaking, you see that the Yukawa interaction actually generates the mass for the fermions, right? So now, of course, I'm talking about the X expectation value, but there is also a fluctuation above the X expectation value, which is the Higgs boson, right? So here you also have to put the Higgs boson. So the same operator, generate both the mass and the interaction with the Higgs boson. So it's a 3-point vertex, right? It's a 3-point vertex between two fermions and one Higgs boson. So you have a new vertex of Feynman diagrams. So H, E, E. And then this vertex here is proportional to the mass of the particle, the mass of the electron, divided by the X expectation value, right? Okay, for the normalization, you also put a square root of 2 in front of the X field, right? So you can actually repeat the same story also for the quark, right? So you have the doublet of left-handed quark times H, and this time I think you need a H dagger, whatever, H complex conjugate, times, let's say, up left. So this will be a Yukawa coupling for the up type quark. And now you can introduce a different flavor of quarks. So I and J, right? And you have something similar for the down, Q, L. And then it will be H and not H dagger, actually. Okay, it doesn't matter. And you have another Yukawa coupling, D, I, J, right? So you can check, I mean, look simply at the U1 charges that we wrote yesterday in this big table that describes the standard model, and you will notice that this is invariant under the U1 symmetry. Right? So again, you know, you expand around the X expectation value, so this will generate IAJU times this times you will be up left bar I V, so I will put the square root of 2 here, plus H up, sorry, it should be right here, right? Up left, up right, J, right? And the same thing for the down type quark. Down, square root of 2, down left I bar, V plus H, down right J, right? So clearly by looking at the SU2 contraction here, you know, the thing that is proportional to the X expectation value will pick up actually the up component here and the down component here because I don't have the complex conjugate, right? In such a way that at the end of the day anyway, you need to build something which is invariant under U1 electromagnetism, right? So clearly you need the up here and the down here, right? Okay. So now in principle, you know, those Yukawa matrices are matrices, 3x3 matrices in the flavor space. So they don't have to be diagonal, right? But you can diagonalize those matrices here, and this will simply reproduce the mass term for the up quark and the down quark, right? And now you notice that here the interaction of the X, you know, are always proportional to the Yukawa matrices. So as soon as you diagonalize this mass matrix here, which is proportional to V, you are automatically sure that the X coupling to the quark are also diagonal in the flavor space. So what I mean by this is that there is no flavor changing neutral current mediated by the X exchange. Right? So no X FCNC, flavor changing neutral current, simply because of this, the form of the Yukawa interaction, right? So X, FCNC are absent in the standard model. So that's really a big, an important property, right, of the X in the standard model. The X doesn't change the flavor of the lepton, it doesn't change the flavor of the quark, right? So in particular, you know, you cannot have a decay of the X into a tau and a muon, a tau and an electron, right? So probably I need to put some bars, I mean, to conserve the electric charge, but whatever. So this is not possible in the standard model because there is no flavor changing neutral current associated to the X particle, right? So this never occur in the standard model, right? Right. But that's very peculiar because, you know, the mass term only originate from this dimension 4 Yukawa interaction. So now what happens, for instance, if you have physics beyond the standard model, and in addition to this operator here, you will add extra power of the X field, right? So for instance, you can say I have extra flavor indices, which is proportional to H squared, V squared, or lambda squared, the new mass scale, times upright, right? J. So in this case, you can still go into, you know, the vacuum expectation value. So this will generate this time a correction to the mass that will be Cij v squared over 2 lambda squared, right? And then you want to again expand around the x expectation value, so you will have 1 power of h here plus h. And now you have to be careful because when you're expanding around the expectation value, here you have h cubed, right? So you have h, h, something that looks like h cubed, and h cubed is v plus h to the cube, so this is v cubed plus, so v cubed is this, right? Plus 3 v squared h, right? So you have this extra factor 3 now for the coupling, for the interaction with the x field. So it will be 3 times Cij v squared divided by 2h squared, right? Lambda squared, upright, right? So you are still allowed now to diagonalize the mass term, but if you look at the interaction with the x, so missing 1 power of the x field. Now if you look at the interaction with the x, the two fermions, the two up quarks with the interaction with the x, the two matrices are not proportional anymore, right? The mass term, Mij, is simply proportional to Yij times 1 plus Cij v squared 2 lambda squared, right? While the interaction with the x, so let's say Gij is Yij 1 plus 3 Cij v squared divided by 2 lambda squared, right? So what I mean by that is that you can diagonalize this matrix, but in general, for generic coupling Cij, those two matrices won't commute, right? Because of this factor 3. So if they don't commute, it means that you cannot, in principle, you cannot diagonalize simultaneously those two matrices, right? In this case, you do expect some X flavor changing neutral current, right? So for this particular theory, when I've added those higher power of Yukawa interaction, in this case, I do expect some X flavor changing neutral current, right? Right. So this property, this basic property, this absence of X efficiency is really a characteristic of the standard model, but it's very easy actually to go beyond it and get a structure which is very different, right? So in this theory, you do expect to see those decay, right? So that's why it's very interesting to actually look at this particular decay, right? Because it will tell you actually what is really the origin of the fermion masses. Whether it's really the standard model or whether you have actually some simple physics beyond the standard model. And at the moment, we have no real clue about the origin of the fermion masses. In the standard model, we describe as those Yukawa interaction, but the truth is that we have no proof at the moment that this is a correct description, right? So this is why looking at this particular decay is really important, because it will really teach us a lot about the flavor structure, the origin of flavor, the origin of the masses for the quark and the leptons, right? Okay? Is it clear? Any question? Yes?
Just to be sure, you make it sound very strict about the Higgs FCNCs, but this is a tree-level statement, right?
Yes.
W around it.
That's true. Yeah, you can compute these things in the standard model. At the end of the day, as we have seen, as also David was saying yesterday, there are some accidental symmetry in the standard model. The lepton number and baryon number are accidental symmetry. So they will be broken by non-perturbative effect, like this Phaleron and instanton effect, but these are highly suppressed, right? So you don't expect to see those big effects in the standard model. So here, in physics beyond the standard model, you do expect to generate those transitions at the tree level. Of course, you still need to understand, really how you could generate, for instance, this higher dimensional operator. That's something we will discuss maybe on Thursday. In some compositics model, you do expect to see those operators appearing, right? Okay, so that was the fermion sector. So now, as I told you yesterday, you also introduce the X to actually generate the mass of the gauge boson. Actually, that was the main idea of really behind the X mechanism, how to generate the mass to the W and the Z. And this is simply coming from the kinetic term for the Higgs boson, right? So I told you that you're introducing the Higgs doublet, and of course to make the theory invariant under this SU2 symmetry, SU2 cross U1 symmetry, you need to replace the kinetic term for the scalar field, you know, that the simple kinetic term for the scalar field. Well, maybe okay. We should put some dagger since it's a complex field, right? It's a dagger. So this is not invariant under local transformation of SU2, simply because, you know, under local transformation, this will transform as a function of space-time as H, and then the derivative will act on this transformation matrix, and this doesn't leave the kinetic term invariant, right? So you know how to proceed to make the theory invariant is to replace the kinetic term by its covariant kinetic term, right? So d mu H is simply d mu H minus plus I j W mu A, the generator of SU2, sigma A over 2 times H, plus I G prime over 2 B mu times H, right? So what I'm saying here is that the Higgs doublet is really a doublet under the SU2 symmetry. So the generator and SU2 are just the Pauli matrices divided by 2. And it has an hypercharge which is equal to 1/2. So it has to couple to the B mu field, the gauge boson associated to the U1 symmetry. So now the Lagrangian simply is the usual one, simply d mu H squared, right? So now what will happen in the vacuum? In the vacuum, you replace the Higgs doublet by its vacuum expectation value. So this kinetic term actually contains a piece which is quadratic in the gauge boson in the vacuum, right? So when you replace the Higgs by its VEV, right, this kinetic term become a quadratic Lagrangian for the gauge boson, and a quadratic Lagrangian is simply a mass term for the gauge boson. Okay. So now we can write it explicitly. Maybe it doesn't. Okay. So here I can write explicitly what this thing is. So it's d mu plus I. So sigma 3. So do you remember the Pauli matrices? So sigma 1 is 1 1. Sigma 2 is I minus I, and sigma 3 is 1 minus 1, right? So let me write it explicitly. So it will be 1/2 GW3 mu plus G prime P mu minus GW mu 3 plus G prime B mu GW mu 1 minus I W mu 2 G W mu 1 plus I W mu 2 acting on the Higgs field, right? Okay, so here you will see that this Lagrangian in the vacuum, right, contain a piece. So you need to multiply this by, okay, so the Higgs in the vacuum is simply 0 V square root of 2, right? So at the end of the day, you will get 1/8, right? W mu 1 plus minus I W mu 2 times the complex conjugate, right? Up and times G squared. And then you have this complicated mass matrix for the diagonal, for the neutral gauge boson that are mixing actually the the B mu and W3 component. Right? So it's 1/8 G W mu 3 minus G prime B mu squared. And everything is multiplied by V squared, right? Okay. Plus, of course, you will get some interaction between the Higgs and the gauge boson, right? Okay, W mu squared, whatever. When you're expanding above above the vacuum expectation value. So what is the mass spectrum here? So you will get actually a massive electrically charged gauge boson, right, by introducing the W plus and W minus. Okay. You don't need maybe this matrix here. So you're introducing W plus minus, which is 1 over square root of 2 W mu 1 minus plus I W mu 2 in such a way that you rewrite this simply as 1/4 G squared V squared W mu plus W mu minus. Right? So you have a mass for the W, mW squared, which is 1/4 G squared V squared. And now, what else? You have a mixing between W3 and B. So you have one linear combination that gives you the Z boson, and the orthogonal linear combination, which is a photon that remains massless. Okay. So you have Z, okay, Z mu, it will be G W mu 3 minus G prime B mu. And then just to make it canonically normalized, so you need to perform a rotation, right? So it's G squared plus G prime squared, right? And the photon is just the orthogonal linear combination, so the same square root, with G prime W mu 3 plus G B mu. And the mass of the Z is 1/4. So you need to extract the normalization, so it will be 1/4 G squared plus G prime squared times V squared, and the mass of the photon is exactly equal to 0. That's something you could predict it simply from the fact that you have an unbroken U1 symmetry. You know, I'm breaking SU2 cross U1 down to U1 electromagnetism, so you have one unbroken gauge symmetry, so you should expect one massless gauge boson, and this is a photon, right? Okay. So I tell you that here, you know, you need to perform a rotation to go from the gauge eigenstate basis, W3 and B, to the mass eigenstate basis, right? And usually this rotation is what is called the weak rotation. So this introduces a mixing angle, the rotation angle, you know, from one basis to the other, and you have sine squared theta. The rotation is simply G prime squared divided by G squared plus G prime squared. Right? Okay? Good. So at this stage, you know, you can compute one important quantity that plays an important role in electric precision data, which is called the rho parameter. From that, you will understand some extra symmetry structure of the standard model. So the rho parameter is simply the ratio of the mass of the W divided by the mass of the Z divided by cos squared theta W. Right? So we can do the computation explicitly in the standard model at 3 levels. So far, I'm doing all the computation at 3 levels, right? And you won't see much loop computation actually in those lectures. So the mass of the W is 1/4 G squared V squared. The mass of the Z is 1/4 G squared plus G prime squared V squared. Cosine squared theta is actually G squared divided by G prime squared plus G squared, right? Okay? So what is the result? So G squared cancel, V squared cancel, G prime squared plus G prime squared cancel, 1/4 cancel, right? And you get a simple result that at 3 levels, you expect the rho parameter to be equal to 1 in the standard model. And there is an important theorem in theoretical physics, which is telling you that after a long computation, you found a very simple result, 0, 1, pi. It means that either you have done a mistake, right? You got a cancellation that, I mean, you screwed up the sign, you got 0, it shouldn't be 0. Or there is a deep reason why the result is simple. And this deep reason is usually associated to a symmetry. Okay. So the fact that the rho parameter is equal to 1 is actually an indication that there is an extra symmetry that we haven't still identified in the standard model. And this extra symmetry is actually what is called the custodial symmetry. The custodial symmetry is an approximate global symmetry of the standard model that corresponds to the particular structure of the Higgs potential that we are introducing to break this electroic symmetry. So, if you remember, I've introduced the Higgs potential of this form. Right? This Mexican hat potential, like this. Right? So now the Higgs doublet is a doublet of a complex field, right? So X actually correspond to 4 real scalar degrees of freedom, right? 4 real field, right? 4 real scalar field, right? So I don't know, X is simply what is, we say that it's H plus, H0, and each of those fields are actually complex fields, so we really have 4 real degrees of freedom, right? I don't know, it could be 1 H plus real part plus I imaginary part of H plus. The same thing here, right? Real part of H0 plus I imaginary part of H0, right? So now it's easy to understand that what I wrote H squared, right, is simply the norm, so it will be actually something which is just the sum of the modulus of all this scalar field, right? Plus real part of H0 squared plus imaginary part of H0 squared, right? And this is a quantity which is invariant under SO4 symmetry, right? I can perform any rotation among those 4 components of the Higgs doublet, right? 4 real components of the Higgs doublet. So the potential here is invariant under the SO4 symmetry, right? And you probably know that SO4 is actually nothing else than SU2 cross SU2. Right? At least, if you're working at the level of the algebra, there is no distinction about the double covering, etc. So at the level of the algebra, SO4 is really equivalent to SU2 cross SU2. Right? We're coming back to that in a moment. So this SU2 is actually the gauge symmetry, the SU2 gauge symmetry. But there is an extra global symmetry which is not gauge. So it's not a global symmetry of the it's not a local symmetry of the standard model. It's just a global symmetry of the Higgs potential. Right? So that's a symmetry of your Lagrangian. So now what will happen in the vacuum, right? So what is the symmetry breaking pattern associated to the Higgs wave? So we are going to see very easily that this global symmetry by the Higgs expectation value is actually broken to the SU2 diagonal symmetry, SU2 vectorial symmetry. So here we usually say that it's SU2 left cross SU2 right, and SU2 vectorial or SU2 diagonal simply means that I'm using the same element for SU2 left and SU2 right? So how can I see this symmetry breaking pattern? There's various ways to do it. The simplest way, and that you will also understand actually this identity among this group or these algebras, is actually to build a 2x2 matrix out of H. So usually I have the X, which is a doublet, right? It's a doublet, a scalar doublet. So out of this I will actually build a matrix phi, which is a 2x2 matrix, simply by this H complex conjugate and H, right? So it's a 2 vector. I'm adding another 2 vectors, so it's really a 2x2 matrix, right? Matrix. So I'm allowed to do that simply because the doublet of SU2 is actually what is called a pseudo-real transformation. So its complex conjugate actually transform under SU2 exactly transform as the same way as H, right? There is no distinction on the SU2 symmetry for doublet and anti-doublet, right? SU2, the doublet, the fundamental representation is a pseudo-real representation. So that's why, I'm allowed really to combine H and H dagger because they transform in the same way under the SU2 symmetry, right? So concretely, what is this matrix, right? So H, okay, I can say that it's H plus H0. So I sigma 2 H complex conjugate is simply what? Is 1 minus 1, right? For I sigma 2. H complex conjugate is H minus the complex conjugate of H plus and H0 complex conjugate, right? So this is supposed to be H0 complex conjugate minus H minus, right? Okay, so phi is actually equal to H complex conjugate minus H minus H plus H0, right? So how this symmetry is acting actually? So SO4, under SO4, under SU2 cross SU2 left cross SU2 right, phi will transform as G left, phi G right dagger, right? So it's a 2 by 2 matrix, so you can act by SU2 transformation on the left and on the right. And that's exactly the transformation property of this matrix phi, right? So now, let's see, what else? You can see that actually phi dagger phi, so it's still a 2 by 2 matrix, right? And that should be, okay, we can do the computation if you want. Phi dagger, so it will be H0. So you need to take the transpose and the complex conjugate. So it will be minus H minus H plus H0 complex conjugate times H0 complex conjugate minus H minus H plus H0, right? And if you're looking at least on the diagram, okay, so it's H0 times H0 dagger minus H plus H minus, okay, so it will be H complex conjugate here. The same thing here for the H plus H minus H plus H0 dagger H0, right? And the off diagonal element, let's say it's H0 H plus minus H plus S0, so it's 0. And here is the same thing, H minus H0 dagger plus H0 dagger minus H minus, so this is also 0, right? So this matrix phi dagger phi is actually proportional to the identity, right? H dagger times the identity matrix in 2 by 2, right? So if you want, you can actually rewrite this potential, right? VH is simply V of phi is lambda. So you can take the trace, for instance, H is simply 1/2 of the trace phi dagger phi minus V squared over 2 squared. Okay, so we'll put the 2 in front of it, so 1/4, right? And now, this is quite obvious that this potential is indeed invariant on the SU2 left cross SU2 right, right? Simply because if you perform a transformation on the left and on the right, right, this will transform as, so I say G left, so it will be G right times phi dagger times G left dagger. Phi is G left, phi G right dagger. So this is identity, right? And now if you're taking the trace, you can permute. So it will be G right dagger times phi dagger phi, and this is exactly equivalent to trace of phi dagger phi, right? So this is indeed invariant under SO4, right? Or SO4 or SU2 cross SU2, right? Is it clear? So here I've really shown you explicitly, at least in this representation, that SO4 is equivalent to SU2 left cross SU2 right. That's yes.
Question about the number of generators, because at first we're starting with SO4, which has 6 generators. In the end, he breaks it down to SU2, which is just left with 3 generators. So what happens to the other ones? Are they some kind of Goldstone boson?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. They are the Goldstone boson, yes. I've done this exercise to really identify the Goldstone boson, the structure of the Goldstone boson of the standard model, So usually, people are talking about SU2 left cross SU2 cross U1. So it's again dimension 4, right? Dimension 3, dimension 1, broken to U1 of electromagnetism. So 3 gauge direction are broken, so you expect 3 Goldstone boson. And these 3 Goldstone boson are eaten, let's say, by the X mechanism to become the longitudinal component of the W and the Z. So I'll come back to this in a moment. But actually, this is not the right structure of the Goldstone boson. The right structure of the Goldstone boson is really this coset space, SO4 broken to SU2 diagonal. Or if you want, SO4 broken to SO3. So SU2 is actually same thing as SO3, right? So what I want to tell you is that the structure of the Goldstone boson in the standard model is not the coset space here. It's actually associated to this coset SO4 divided by SO3. Exactly like in QCD, when you're with chiral symmetry breaking, you're describing the pion with exactly the same coset space. Right? Yes. Okay. So I still want to show that in the vacuum, so when the X take its expectation value, actually I'm left with this SU2 vectorial symmetry. But this is quite obvious, right? In the vacuum, so the X take its expectation value. So phi, so it's only H0 that takes a real expectation value. So in the vacuum, phi is actually proportional to the identity, right? In the vacuum, where is this? So when V is not equal to 0, phi is simply V times identity, right? And this is invariant under the SU2 diagonal symmetry, right? So phi, I said, transform as G left phi times G right dagger. But the identity is invariant if you are using G left equal G right, right? So this vacuum, right, is invariant under SU2 vectorial or SU2 diagonal symmetry, right? Meaning that I can perform any transformation of SU2 provided that I'm using the same transformation on the left and on the right. This will leave the vacuum invariant, right? So really here, the breaking structure at the level of the global symmetry is SO4 broken to SO3, or SU2 left cross SU2 right broken to SU2 diagonal. Okay. Any question? So I say actually that this is only an approximate global symmetry. It's approximate for various reasons. First of all, here, I've combined H and H dagger, or H complex conjugate. So this is fine when you're looking at the SU2 transformation, but of course, if you're looking at the hypercharge, those two objects have opposite hypercharge, right? H is hypercharge 1/2, H complex conjugate is hypercharge minus 1/2, right? So this doesn't have a right gauge transformation under the hypercharge. So this custodial symmetry is actually broken when you gauge the U1 hypercharge subgroup, right? So U1 is actually a subgroup of SU2 right. So in a sense, you are breaking this global symmetry by gauging only a subgroup of this global symmetry. So this means that at loop level, that's something I haven't told you yet. Why I do expect rho equal 1 associated to this custodial symmetry. I'll come back to that in a moment. But it means actually that at the quantum level, you do expect some correction to this relation, and this correction will be proportional to the parameter which is breaking this global symmetry, so it will be proportional to G prime, right? G prime squared, actually, times the loop factor. And you can compute that explicitly in the standard model. At the loop level, you do get some deviation, so rho minus 1 will be proportional to G prime squared divided by 16 pi squared times some, I think, some log and things like that. But you do expect something which is proportional to the breaking factor of the custodial symmetry. So, yeah, so I told you that this result is actually associated to the unbroken SO3 symmetry, so unbroken in the vacuum. So, since it is unbroken symmetry in the vacuum, okay, it means that the spectrum, the mass spectrum, should respect this symmetry, right? Yes?
So, why is it not broken at tree level? Because at tree level, even at tree level, is this not
yes. First I need to tell you why actually rho equal 1 is the consequences of the custodial symmetry, and then you will see why this result is not changed by this gauging. Yeah. Okay. So why rho equal 1 is actually linked to the existence of this custodial symmetry. So, I mean, custodial symmetry means, unbroken symmetry in the vacuum means that the mass spectrum need to respect this unbroken symmetry, right? So how do the field transform under this symmetry, right, under this SO3? So if you take the free gauge boson of SU2, they transform WA, right, for A equal 1, 2, and 3. They transform as an adjoint representation of SU2 left, right? It is just gauge symmetry, so they transform as a triplet under SU2 left, right? Triplet of SU2 left. So this means that they will transform also as a triplet under the SO3 symmetry for SU2 diagonal. So it will transform as a triplet of SU2 diagonal symmetry. Right? So if they transform as a triplet, it means that when you're looking at the quadratic piece, you should expect the same coefficient for W1 squared, W2 squared, and W3 squared. Right? So by the existence of the symmetry, you know that you will have the same factor A, right, times W mu 1 squared plus W mu 2 squared plus W mu 3 squared, right? That's the only thing which is invariant under this SO3 symmetry in the vacuum, right? So now you can rewrite explicitly this expression in terms of the mass eigenstate, right? In terms of the W and the Z. So you already know that this is nothing else than twice W mu W plus W mu minus. And now what is W3, right? So you need to go back to the Z and the photon, and in this case it will be actually cos squared theta W times the Z gauge boson, right? So what do you expect by the custodial symmetry? You expect that indeed the mass of the W, right? So SO3 symmetry tells you that the mass of the W squared should be equal to the mass of the Z times cos squared theta W, right? So you have proven here that the rho parameter is equal to 1 as the consequences of the unbroken SO3 symmetry in the vacuum. So now to come back to your question, you see that actually the breaking or the gauging of U1 is actually what is responsible for this mixing angle. Right? So if you don't gauge the U1, you expect actually that the mass of the W is equal to the mass of the Z. So the breaking is included in this mixing angle. So is there any question there? So we have identified really an important global symmetry or approximate global symmetry of the standard model. Right. There is another piece actually which is also breaking this global symmetry, which is the mass difference between the bottom and the top, right? So if SU2 left cross SU2 right were an exact symmetry, you were expecting actually to have the same Yukawa interaction for the top and the bottom. So the same mass for the top and the bottom, but this is not the case in the standard model. So you have a breaking, and this breaking will also generate a deviation to ρ = 1, which is proportional to the mass difference between the bottom and the top quark, right? So now you probably need a mass scale here, so it's v squared, and then again there is a loop factor, and in this case it will be also a logarithmic, it will be proportional to the log, I think, of, I don't remember, no, mh squared divided by v squared, okay. Something like that. So it will be a small correction anyway that you can compute and check that it agrees with the electroic precision data, right? Okay. So now, so I've done this exercise because that was really important, you know, to understand actually what are the symmetry structure of the Goldstone boson of the standard model. So the Goldstone boson are really, you know, the Goldstone boson that you expect from the breaking of SO4 down to SO3. So as one of you said, SO4 is dimension 6, SO3 is dimension 3. So you expect 3 Goldstone boson. And those 3 Goldstone boson, at the end of the day, will become the longitudinal component of the W and the Z, right? By the X mechanism. Okay? So maybe we can do this counting here. It's always useful to do, to make sure that you haven't lose or created any degrees of freedom. So let's say in the vacuum, so V is equal to 0. So in the unbroken phase, what is the spectrum of your theory, right? So you have the 3 gauge boson, W mu, for A equal 1, 2, and 3, and you have B mu, and you have the X field, right? So you have 4 gauge boson, which are massless gauge boson. So 4 times 2 degrees of freedom, right? And here I have 4 degrees of freedom in the X doublet, right? So I end up with 12 degrees of freedom, right? 12 real degrees of freedom. So what is happening in the broken phase when the X has acquired its expectation value? Well, I have the W plus, W minus. I have the Z, which are massive gauge boson. I have the photon. And I told you that I have the physical Higgs boson, right? So a massive gauge field, and I come back to that, has free polarization. So it's 3 times 3, right? I have the longitudinal polarization that doesn't exist for the photon. The photon has only 2 polarization, right? So times 2, and I have one physical real scalar degrees of freedom, which is the Higgs field, right? So here, at the end of the day, you get 9, 10, 12, right? So you have the same number of degrees of freedom in the unbroken phase and in the broken phase, right? So you simply have rearranged your degrees of freedom, right? In the broken phase, in the unbroken phase, you have degrees of freedom which are contained in the Higgs doublet. After electric symmetry breaking, some of those degrees of freedom actually are eaten to become the longitudinal component of the W and the Z. Right. So that should be clear. I hope you all know this. Anyway, so now what I want to do, so we have identified really those Goldstone boson, you know, that will become here. These are the Goldstone boson associated to this breaking of SO4 down to SO3. So what I want to tell you now is that actually you can really describe the physics of this Goldstone boson, and I will tell you that this will be the relevant degrees of freedom at high energy. Right? I will give you various reasons for that. So they will be the relevant degrees of freedom, and in a sense, you know, I can give you really a full effective description of the physics of the interaction of this Goldstone boson, simply by the symmetry structure of my theory. Right? So I don't need to know all the details of, you know, the gauging of the symmetry, etc. All what I want to use is this coset space, right? So how can I describe actually this, the physics of this Goldstone boson, right? This is simply a symmetry breaking pattern, right? So we'll introduce a sigma matrix, which is a 2 by 2 matrix, which again transform at G left across sigma times G right dagger, right? And I can simply assume that sigma takes an expectation value which is just proportional to the identity, and this will break SO4 down to SO3, right? So in the vacuum, sigma is just proportional to identity, right? And I have the scale of this breaking, which will be V, let's say, right? So what is the effective Lagrangian that really describes this symmetry breaking pattern, right? You can write a Lagrangian, which is simply V squared over 4 trace d mu sigma, right? So that will be a series which is invariant on the SU2 cross SU2 left cross SU2 right. Here I've also introduced some covariant derivative, namely that I will allow myself actually to weakly gauge a subgroup of this SO4 symmetry, right? So we'll use d sigma, which is d mu sigma. So that will be invariant simply under the global SU2 cross SU2, right? But now I want to gauge a subgroup, so we'll add plus I, j, w mu a, sigma a over 2 times sigma minus I, g prime, b mu sigma 3 over 2, right? Okay. Yes?
Could you maybe repeat the argument why that symmetry breaking relates to the difference between the top and the bottom one?
Okay. So now you would like to see how, for instance, the SU2 right symmetry will act on the fermions, right? And you can see that so the top and the bottom, so now you have the top, so left and right, bottom right. And in order for the theory to be invariant under the SU2 symmetry, somehow you will need to embed or to form a doublet of SU2 right symmetry from the top right and the bottom right, right? So this will come as a doublet, and then if you want now the Yukawa Lagrangian to be invariant under this SU2 right symmetry, you see that necessarily you need the top Yukawa to be equal to the bottom Yukawa, right? Right. Otherwise, I mean, the SU2 right symmetry is broken, right? Okay. So what I want to say is that this Lagrangian is really describing, if you want, the effective interaction of my Goldstone boson, right? So first of all, you can, of course, start with this Lagrangian, go into the unitary gauge. So when sigma is proportional to identity, right? So sigma is just identity, so the usual kinetic term is 0, sigma is 1, sigma is 1. So that again gives me simply a Lagrangian which is quadratic in the gauge field, and I mean everything has been constructed in such a way that actually this is exactly the mass of the W times W mu plus W mu minus plus 1/2 mz squared z mu nu squared, right? So in the unitary gauge, that's the unitary gauge, this Lagrangian exactly reproduces the mass term for the gauge boson. But now I'm interested in the Goldstone interaction, so I want to keep actually, I want to work in a gauge where the Goldstone are in my spectrum, so I simply want to expand sigma with the Goldstone boson, so it will be 1I by A sigma A over V times, so it's a 2x2 matrix, times identity, right? So that the Goldstone will be the fluctuation above the vacuum expectation value, right? So this will correspond to the maybe I need also to okay. Well, it commute anyway, so yes. So that's, if you want, in the non-unitary gauge when you keep the Goldstone in the spectrum, right? So you can now go, for instance, I mean, take this Lagrangian, go to the gaugeless limit, so you turn on you turn off all the gauge interaction, right? And you will simply have some interaction for the Goldstone boson, right? So you expand this exponential, the exponential of the Goldstone boson, right? So it will be, okay, 1 plus I pi a sigma a of v plus 1/2 of the squared, etc., right? Right? So here, so when you keep the linear piece here, right? So it will be d mu pi. So this will actually reproduce the kinetic term for the pion field. So it will be 1/2. Again, I've chosen this normalization in such a way that the pions are canonically normalized. Right? You can check that. So the first term in this effective Lagrangian is simply the kinetic term for the pion. Right? But of course, I'm dealing here with a nonlinear sigma model, so I also have some interaction with more and more power of the pion field, right? And you can compute explicitly that the next term will be 1/6 v squared pi a d mu pi a squared. So the next term involves 4 pion field, and actually there is another term that you can write at the pi to the 4th level, which is v squared pi a squared d mu pi b squared, right? Plus etc., right? Plus higher power pi to the 6 plus etc., right? So I do get some Lagrangian that describe, interaction with many pions. So what do you expect from this Lagrangian? You expect exactly like in QCD. Actually, you expect to see some pion scattering that will grow with the energy. Yes. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes. Okay. Don't know. Simply because here I'm dealing with a 2x2 matrix, so I'm acting on the left and on the right, right? And when you're acting on the right, you need to put the generator on the right of your matrix, right? So usually, when we are writing the covariant kinetic term for the X doublet, it's a vector, right? So all the field are acting on the left. But now I have a matrix, so I have some gauge transformation that are acting on the left and some that are acting on the right. So you need to put the generator on the right, on the good side of the matrix. Right? Well, it's just group theory. I mean, you know how they transform, and just to make a covariant derivative transforming linearly under the gauge transformation, right?
The action of the group.
Yes.
One attention.
Yes. I mean, you can, if you want, you can check, that this covariant derivative transform linearly under the gauge transformation. That will be a check, and that's how you build this covariant derivative. Right? That's the only property that you want from a covariant derivative. Yeah. I mean, it's group theory, so it's always a little bit cumbersome to write explicitly the action of the matrices, etc. But at the end of the day, it works. Right? Okay, so here I want to say simply that I have some interaction that involve multiple pion, and those interaction involve some derivative. So I have some vertex. For instance, I have a 4 pi vertex that involve a derivative. So this means that I do expect some pi scattering, right? So pi a, pi b, pi c, pi d. Right? I have a vertex here coming from this term. It's an interaction among 4 Goldstone bosons, 4 pions, and this Goldstone boson, this vertex involves 2 derivatives. So this means that when you're computing this amplitude, you will see something which is growing like the squared of the energy, where the energy of the incoming pion. Right? So simply, I mean, without doing any computation, you can really expect to see a scattering amplitude m that goes like s. So this is a Mandelstam variable, so it's e squared, if you want, divided by v squared. This is the only scale that you have in your theory, right? Okay, you can do the computation explicitly. You know, from this Lagrangian, you can derive the Feynman rules with the momentum of the pion, etc. You know, you symmetrize to get the Feynman rules, and you get something that looks like this: delta AB, delta CD, plus I think it will be the t variable divided by v squared, delta AC, delta BD, plus a u variable. U divided by v squared, delta AD, delta BC, right? But anyway, the basic block is really a scattering amplitude that grows with the energy in the center of mass. So that was, you know, really the description of the pion, right? So now if you want to come back, let's say, to the standard model with this gauge boson, right? I told you that you have this longitudinal polarization of the W and the Z. So you can actually, I'll write explicitly in a moment this longitudinal polarization. So, but you have some longitudinal polarization, which is an object which also grows with the energy. So in the standard model, you know, the equivalent of this diagram will be, let's say, a vertex that involves four longitudinal polarization, and this is proportional to G squared. Right, the vertex among gauge boson, proportional to gauge coupling squared. Each of the external leg grows with the energy divided by the mass. So you expect a diagram that grows like the fourth power of the energy. So that doesn't really match this result, right? It's growing like e squared only. But actually what happens is that in the standard model, not only you have a quartic vertex, but you have also a cubic vertex. So you can exchange here, in this case, a Z or a photon, right? You can do the computation. It's proportional to G. So each of the vertex is proportional to G, so it will be G squared. You have one propagator, so it will be proportional to divided by E squared. In the high energy limit, you know, when the energy is much larger than the mass. But the vertex here also involve a derivative, right? It's a vertex with free gauge boson, and if you remember where those vertices are coming from, it's coming from F mu nu squared. F mu nu is d mu a nu minus d nu a mu plus G times a mu a nu, right? Squared. So the quartic coupling is really coming from the quadratic piece of the non-abelian interaction, so it's proportional to G squared, but the cubic vertex here is the cross product between the non-abelian piece and the usual kinetic term. So that involves one derivative. So each of the vertex here is proportional to the energy, so it will be proportional to E squared. And then I have the four external leg that grows like the energy to the fourth. Like the energy. So now you can do the computation explicitly, and actually there is a cancellation between those two diagrams. So the e to the fourth term cancel is non-trivial. I mean, it's really a result of the non-abelian structure of the SU2 cross U1 symmetry, right? So you need really this particular relation between the quartic interaction and the cubic interaction for this cancellation to take place. And here you get the cancellation, and you get, at the end of the day, you get something that is proportional to G squared, E divided by the mass of the W squared. Exactly like what you obtain from pi-pi scattering, right? So the pion here are equivalent to the longitudinal component of the W, right? So you can do the computation in both cases, you know, in the unitary gauge, where you keep explicitly the longitudinal polarization, or you can do your computation, you know, keeping track only of the relevant degrees of freedom, which are the longitudinal polarization that you can describe as a Goldstone boson. And of course, you get a perfect matching between those two computations. Right? So even all the numerical coefficients that I haven't written here, it requires a lot of work to compute explicitly those coefficients, but you will find that they agree, of course, in both description, right? So again, at this stage, we are in trouble, right? Because we have a scattering amplitude that grows with the energy. Like what we discussed, in the Fermi theory, when you are looking at the scattering of an electron and a neutrino, that was something that was also growing with the energy. So that was an indication, that you needed to introduce new degrees of freedom to make sure that the scattering amplitude remains finite at high energy, right? It's an inconsistency of your effective description. So here, I'm still missing, somehow in this description, in those computations, I'm still missing a contribution of a new degrees of freedom. And this new degrees of freedom, I'm sure you already know, is actually the exchange of the Higgs boson. Right? So if I've described only the scattering of the longitudinal component of the W, but in addition to these degrees of freedom, I have the physical Higgs boson. So can I understand actually what are the coupling of the Higgs boson? Just by requiring that the Higgs boson will take care of cancelling the scattering amplitude. Right? That's the only requirement that I want. Right? I want to build my theory by getting rid of the inconsistency of my construction. Right? Here I have an effective description of this, degrees of freedom that has been observed. The W, the Z has been observed at CERN in the UA1 and UA2 experiment in 92, 93. So people knew that there is a longitudinal polarization associated to the W simply because they have measured the mass. So they have identified these degrees of freedom. Just from this symmetry construction, you know exactly the interaction of those degrees of freedom, right? And you see that you need to add something else, so to make sense of those interactions at high energy. Right? So that's a wonderful case, right? You measure one quantity, you measure the mass of the W, and you know automatically that you will discover something else at higher energy, right? For the theory to make sense. That's a fantastic case, right? You measure something, you know that you will still discover something else afterwards, right? Unfortunately, at the moment, we are not in this situation anymore. We have measured plenty of things, but there is not a single indication that actually we will observe anything else at higher energy, right? There is some indication, but they are not really theoretical inconsistency at the same level, let's say, as you were violating here unitarity, right? You're violating unitarity, you know that you need to introduce new degrees of freedom to take care of unitarity at high energy. Tomorrow we'll discuss some problem, let's say, associated to the Higgs boson, in particular the Higgs boson mass, but this is not an inconsistency. This is just something which is not very elegant. You require the cancellation, you require the tuning of the parameters, but there is no theoretical inconsistency. Okay, so the Higgs boson. So how can I actually take care of unitarity by the exchange of the Higgs boson? Right? So I want, now what do I want to do? I simply want to extend this Lagrangian, introduce a Higgs field with some particular coupling to make sure that the exchange of the Higgs boson will cancel the piece which is growing with the energy. So V squared divided by 4, trace of d mu sigma dagger, d mu sigma. So here I want to show you that this is a unique solution, but actually it works, right? There is a theorem due to various people in the 70s, in particular Llewellyn Smith, that was also director of CERN, Director General of CERN. He has shown that actually this solution that I'm going to describe is somehow unique solution, right? Only with the exchange of a scalar field. So it will be 1. So that's just describing the mass, the mass of the W and the Z. And now I'm introducing a scalar field that I will call H with some particular coupling, with a parameter A that I will adjust later to make sure that the exchange of the Higgs boson cancels this scattering amplitude. And I will also introduce actually B, a quadratic piece here for some reason that will become clear in a moment. So now I have a new vertex here, which is 2 pion and 1 Higgs boson, right? And this is proportional, let's say, to A divided by V. Right? And also have another vertex, which is pi with 2 Higgs boson, right? and this is proportional to B over V squared, right? So now, what is the contribution of pi-pi scattering due to the exchange of the Higgs boson, right? So you have this, pi, pi. So what is the contribution of this diagram? Well, it will be proportional to A over V squared, right? There's simply two vertex like this. I have one propagator, so it will be S minus the mass of the X squared. And finally here, I have some interaction which are also the mass term, so it will be proportional to S over V squared, right? Each vertex is proportional to the same thing that we had before, right? And you want to compare this, so you want to add this to the previous things that we computed, which is S divided by V squared, right? So here it's only S. Yes, I'm losing some V. Okay. So that's, I mean, that's due to the two derivative, right? Okay. So, well, actually, if you do the computation, there is a minus sign. And you see, I think you see that if A is equal to 1, right, the dominant piece, so for A equal 1 and S much larger, so S much larger than the mass of the X, right? So this is S squared divided by S, so it's S, A, so it's 1 minus A squared, right? So this goes to 0, actually it will go to a constant. It will go to a constant if if A is equal to 1, right? Okay. So concretely is what is, so is V squared times S minus MH squared. So it will be S minus MH squared, you know, from this term, minus A squared times S squared, right? So this is S squared 1 minus A squared minus S MH squared. It will be V squared S minus MH squared. So again, in the large S limit, so for S much larger than MH, so for A equal 1, this cancels, so it's S divided by S, so it's actually proportional to MH squared divided by V squared, right? Okay. So you have seen here that by introducing one Higgs boson, by tuning the coupling of the Higgs to the Goldstone boson, right? By tuning means that I've chosen A equal to 1. I made sure that the scattering amplitude remains finite at high energy. Okay? Yes?
Do it to understand the minus sign?
You just need to write the Feynman rules, and I mean, it's just trivial algebra, but okay, I mean, I'm not going to do it here. I mean, try to do it as an exercise. If you have problem, come back and we'll do it together. If I start doing it on the blackboard now, we'll screw it up and he won't be convinced that there is a minus sign. It is there. Okay? So, A equal 1, make sure that WW scattering remains finite. Now I have introduced extra degrees of freedom, right? I've introduced this Higgs field, so I also need to make sure that, you know, I don't have scattering amplitude for inelastic channel that grows with the energy. So in particular, you can look at WW goes to 2 Higgs boson. So you can look at pi goes to 2 Higgs boson. It could be this diagram, or it could be this diagram, right? The T-channel exchange with so two 2 pion, 1 Higgs boson, so it's coming from A, right? So this is proportional to B, and it will be also S divided by V squared, and this will be proportional to A squared, S minus V squared. Okay, and again, if you do, if you look at the Feynman rules, you will find that there is an extra minus sign. So at the end of the day, those scattering amplitude remains finite, also provided that B is equal to A squared.
Is it second diagram to the left?
Here, sorry.
The right-hand side, is it a Higgs or pi?
So I have 2 pion and 2 Higgs boson.
So, but both the diagrams are different signs.
Right? So, this is this interaction here, right? So I have 2 pions and 2 Higgs boson.
Final state that you're looking at in this process.
Yes, yes. I'm looking at the end of the day, what I'm describing is vector boson fusion of 2 Higgs doublet, right? So in the standard model, this exists. It's just double Higgs production by vector boson fusion. So at the LHC, you can look at this, right? This is, so you have the quark. The quark emit a W, which now you look at the longitudinal polarization, right? So, okay. Something like that, okay. So you have the proton here, PP. So here you have 2 jets, and here it's 2 Higgs boson, right?
So my question was that when you are summing at an amplitude level,
Yes.
then you should have same final state and initial state configuration.
Well, aren't we interested in any final state? So that's why we're summing them?
No, okay, these are 2 different processes, right? I'm looking at pi-pi scattering or WW scattering, and here I'm looking at double Higgs production.
You are summing both the
No, here. No, but here, okay. So this is a contribution from this diagram, and this is a contribution from this vertex, right? So we have seen that this one contains pi to the 4th, right? Okay, sorry. It's getting messy, this blackboard, okay? Okay? Good. So, we have seen that here, I need to introduce a Higgs doublet, the Higgs scalar degrees of freedom, with some particular coupling, A is equal to 1, B is equal to 1, in order to get a series which is unitary, that respects unitarity, when you are looking at any scattering amplitude at high energy, right? You could also try to introduce a fermion in this description. There is a way to describe the fermion masses. The coupling of the sigma matrix with the fermion that will answer also your question why actually you need the top Yukawa to be equal to the bottom Yukawa to respect the SU2 symmetry. So you need to introduce something like sigma. No, I won't find. So it's probably Q left. Sigma, and then up, you will put the up and the bottom into the sigma matrix, top and bottom, like this, right? So right, and then it's 1, so that will correspond to the mass term, and then you introduce coupling CH divided by V, and you can look at pi that are producing two fermions. Now I don't know how to draw the fermion, so it's top, right? One top here. And this again is something that grows with the energy, so it's only square root of S divided by V in this case. And this will be proportional to 1 minus A times C, because you have another diagram that contribute here via the exchange of the Higgs boson, right? Pi. This is A, this is C, right? So at the end of the day, you get 1 minus the product of A times C. So again, you need C equal 1 to get a scattering amplitude that remain finite at high energy. So we have seen really that, the coupling of the Higgs are uniquely determined by the requirement of perturbative unitarity. You have no choice, right? All the coupling of the Higgs, A, B, and C, that you can introduce have to be equal to 1 in this particular normalization for the scattering amplitude to remain finite at high energy. Right? And of course, for this particular value of A equal B equal C, you can actually build or reconstruct the X doublet out of this sigma matrix, or if you want the pion, acting on V plus H divided by square root of 2. Right? Right. And now you can see explicitly that for A equal B, you can reconstruct a perfect squared. So this Lagrangian that I wrote before, the effective Lagrangian, is exactly the one that you are used to, which is a covariant derivative of the X field. But this is only true if A is equal to B is equal to 1, right? That you can reconstruct the perfect squared. So usually, people do the opposite, right? They start with this and, compute explicitly this pi-pi scattering, WW scattering, see that there is a cancellation, etc. But that seems really miraculous, right? While here we have derived that you have no choice. Everything is really fixed by the requirement of perturbative unitarity. So what we have seen in particular here, is that the coupling of the X to the Gauss zone, so the coupling of the X to the W, are proportional to the mass of the W. Right? So if you remember, when you expand, in the unitary gauge, this trace is exactly the mass of the W and the mass of the Z. Right? So the coupling of the X is proportional to the mass of the particle. And here is the same. The coupling of the X to the fermion are proportional to the mass of the fermion. Right? So that's what you have learned in the books, right? The coupling of the X are proportional to the masses of the particle. And that also what made actually the X so difficult to find at the LHC, right? Because the X coupling are proportional to the masses, so the coupling to the electron is very small, right? Because the electron mass is small. It's small compared to the scale that you have at your disposal, which is a weak scale. So at the end of the day, the probability of producing one X via an electron and positron, right? This coupling is proportional to the mass of the electron divided by V. And this is something like, it's probably a squared, whatever. It's probably 10 to minus 10 or 10 to minus 11, right? So the only chance that you have to produce a X, just by this argument, is by coupling to the top quark. Top. Then the probability will be of order 1, right? Probability of producing X by fusion of top quarks. The problem is that in nature we don't have top quark, right? You first need to produce a top quark. In nature you have only electron, you have up quark, down quark, but all those objects are very, very light. So this means that they are very weakly coupled to the Higgs boson. So you need, in order to produce the Higgs boson at the LHC, you first need to produce a top quark, and then the top quark can produce the Higgs boson. Right? So this is exactly what is happening. So you have the quark, the proton, whatever. The proton emits the gluon. Right? There is a lot of gluon inside the proton, just by QCD. By quantum field theory, the gluon now is actually producing a top quark, a virtual top quark, and the top quark is producing the Higgs boson. So this is the way the Higgs has been produced at the LHC. It's called gluon-gluon fusion production, so GLU-GLU GGF, gluon-gluon fusion production for the Higgs boson. I was planning actually to give you some argument how to compute this cross-section very easily related to the beta function of QCD. This is what is called the Higgs low energy theorem. Higgs low energy theorem. But that will be for tomorrow probably, because I don't have time to explain you how to compute these things very quickly without doing much computation. Right? And then the Higgs, of course, is an unstable object. It will decay, and in particular, important decay mode at the LHC has been the decay into two photons. Right? So again, proceed via the top quark. You can also proceed via the W gauge boson, because the W has electric charge, so it's coupled to the Higgs, but it's also coupled to the photon. and that was one of the cleanest mode to actually observe the Higgs boson at the LHC. There is of course other decay modes that are a little bit more difficult to observe, simply because here you can easily reconstruct the final state, so you can really distinguish the signal from the background, but there is other decay mode. For instance, the Higgs will decay into 2B quarks. That's the dominant decay mode at the LHC, I mean, of the Higgs boson. It's about 70% of the time. So the branching ratio of the Higgs into 2B quark, it's about 70% or 60 something. But the problem is that it's very difficult to actually observe the 2B quark because there is plenty of B's that are produced purely by QCD, right? So it's very difficult to distinguish the bottom that are produced by the Higgs from the bottom that are produced by QCD. Another important mode has been actually the decay of the Higgs into ZZ bar or ZZ star. So Z star. And so the Higgs cannot decay into 2Z boson on shell simply because the mass of the Higgs is 125 GeV, The mass of the Z is 90 GeV, so 125 cannot produce 180 GeV, right? So one of the Z is actually off shell, but it will decay into 2 leptons, L plus, L minus. So what you observe is actually a 4 lepton final state. Again, this is very clear signal that you can reconstruct in your detector, and from that you are able to observe the Higgs boson. So that were the two main discovery mode of the LHC, the 4 lepton final state and the 2 photon final state. And from that you can easily reconstruct the invariant mass of this object, because you can really observe those objects in a detector, measure their momentum, and from that you reconstruct the invariant mass, and you can see that there is a nice peak that corresponds to the existence of the Higgs boson. Right? So that's the way the Higgs has been observed at the LHC about 5 years ago. Right? Just to give you an order of magnitude estimate, so the cross section for the production of the Higgs, here the dominant production mode, is about 40 picobarn. The luminosity that have been accumulated at the LHC is what is of the order of 30, 50 inverse femtobarn. So this means that we have already produced something like 10 to the 5 or 10 to the 6 Higgs boson, right? Right. So it's a very expensive object to produce, right? I mean, we have spent something like 10 billions to produce 1 million of Higgs. And out of this 1 million of Higgs, I mean, only about 1,000 have been observed, right? Because I told you most of them you cannot observe, you cannot distinguish them from the background because there is a lot of QCD events, right? So you really need to select your particular event. So you need to put some cut on the final state, look at particular branching ratio, etc. So there are about 1,000 Higgs only that have been observed and reconstructed, right? So each of the Higgs boson has been very costly, but we have learned a lot about nature from this Higgs boson, right? Okay. So tomorrow I will continue a little bit to give you some more feeling that indeed there is this equivalence between the longitudinal component of the W and the Z and the Goldstone boson. This is called the Goldstone equivalence theorem, right? So again, it's really understanding what are the relevant degrees of freedom at high energy, which are only the longitudinal polarization. If you are living in a world where the W are very energetic, you can forget about the transverse polarization. Transverse polarization are only pollution. The relevant degrees of freedom, the important degrees of freedom, are the longitudinal polarization. Unfortunately, we have an effective description of this longitudinal polarization in terms of the Goldstone. So I can give you, we will describe two particular interesting process, which is the top decays into W and B. And we will see that there is interesting result depending on the longitudinal polarization of the W here. And there is also the hypothetic decay of the Higgs decaying to 2W. So you will assume that the Higgs is very, very heavy, such that this decay is open. So here you have on-shell final state, and you will see again that in this process what matters in the high energy limit, so in the limit of very heavy Higgs, what matters is the longitudinal polarization. So these are the Goldstone bosons. So all what we care is really at each energy scale, identifying what are the relevant degrees of freedom. So of course in nature, you have all this complication of the transverse polarization, but if you are really interested at understanding the structure of the physics at high energy, you can forget about this transverse polarization, and everything is described by this Goldstone boson. So that's why it was so important to identify the Goldstone, the custodial symmetry, which are really the symmetry structure of the interaction of the Goldstone boson. And from that, you understand everything. Okay, we'll stop here. Thanks.